should intervene in Syria and Iraq against ISIS using ground troops.
No. I'll go along.
The table shakes a lot. Is that okay? The table shakes a lot. Okay.
I would just like to start off this debate by sincerely thanking everybody for being here, for making this hopefully educational event possible, my judges, my opponents, and my colleague. Without further ado, I'm just going to jump right in. The resolution that's been handed to us today is the United States federal government should intervene in Syria and Iraq against ISIS using ground troops. Most of the resolution is pretty self-explanatory. If the negation team has any questions, they can simply ask, which is clearly contextually defined. But because of the word should, which implies a call to action, this will be a policy debate with the judging criteria as net benefits, which essentially means that the side that provides the most good for the most amount of people should win today's debate. Now with that, the plan text of the affirmation team is going to be the United States federal government, through an act of Congress, will send 15,000 troops to combat ISIS in Iraq and Syria. It's just pretty self-explanatory. The time frame will be ASAP, and everything else will be normal ways and means. Okay, with that, the first advantage we have for you today, you can tagline as saving lives. Uniqueness of point one, ISIS is bad. Essentially, ISIS is a terrorist organization, omnicidal terrorist organization. They go through, in Iraq and Syria, they have a large amount of land. They just go through town by town, killing everybody in that town, and they really don't have any preferences what their race is, what ethnicity they are. Whoever they see, they just kill, and they keep moving on, and they're trying to capture as much land as they possibly can. Just last week, they burned a Jordanian pilot in a cage. They put him in a cage, they burned him, and they sent the video all over the internet. So you see, like, ISIS is an extremely cruel organization. So uniqueness of point two, using car bombs. Iraq recently closed one of its major prisons. So essentially, a lot of these prisons and other things are being closed because of ISIS. A lot of these governments in Iraq and in Syria are scared of ISIS, and that is why they have to close these prisons and have to reallocate these prisoners and stuff like this. And essentially, what we see with this is the power of ISIS, because essentially, So essentially, what we see with this is the power of ISIS. A lot of infrastructures has to be moved, and a lot of things have to be changed because ISIS has the ability to come into places and just essentially take over as much land as they possibly can. So essentially this prison in Iraq had to be closed because there was fear that ISIS would come in and they would free all the prisoners in this prison. So this prison essentially had to be closed. Uniqueness of point three, according to the LA Times, the rise of these organizations of late is mostly due to Iraq's sectarian Prime Minister Nouri Maliki, who is no longer held in check by the United States. So essentially, Iraq's Prime Minister is essentially not doing a lot to combat ISIS. The United States has to send in troops because right now, what we see is ISIS is still continuously going over and taking land. They have not been stopped so far. How can we assume that they'll be stopped in the future? We have to take steps. We have to make ramifications to stop ISIS. Point 14, this is ISIS controls roughly 13,000 square mile stretch. That's as big as the country of Belgium. Essentially, ISIS has a lot of land, and the way they get this land is literally they take land away from people. Someone's living in the house, they go into the house, they kill everybody who's living in the house, they take away their land, and they continuously do this again and again until they can get as much land as they possibly can. So number 5, the government estimates that ISIS killed roughly 1,922 people in 2014 and injured specifically June of 2014, and injured 2,016 people. So what we see is ISIS kills a lot of people, and it injures even more, and that is extremely detrimental, obviously, to society as a whole. The link to this is that the plan passes internal AS. Chuck Hagel says U.S. troops in Syria and Iraq is key to fighting ISIS. So point 2, without this, Iraq plus Syria would collapse. U.S. troops key to success. Without the U.S. actually intervening, Iraq and Syria's militaries are not capable enough. If the United States does not intervene, ISIS has the capability to essentially take up larger and larger areas in Iraq and Syria. So the internal 3, Martin Dempsey, establishing borders. So it says we need to establish borders. We need to tell ISIS that it cannot take over this land. The impacts of this is you see less death and less dehumanization. The United States comes in, they take care of ISIS. The ISIS no longer has the ability to continuously go over land and continuously kill people and dehumanize people as they go along. With that, the second advantage we have for you today, you can tagline is limiting ISIS resources. Subpoint 1, ISIS is rapidly growing because of the infrastructure and resources it gains. Essentially, ISIS, as I said before, ISIS goes through villages and towns and takes up as much land as they can, but along with that, they also take away these resources from these people, and they use these resources, they use this money that they collect, and then they buy more weapons, they buy more goods, and the only way we can actually stop ISIS is stop this allocation of resources that ISIS continuously gets because of this. Subpoint 2, so essentially they go from town to town, they kill everybody in their way, and they take away land, and they take away like oil, they take away all these other resources. 3, 85% of ISIS's funding comes from oil they have captured. They capture this oil, they go, like Syria and Iraq, they have like a lot of oil, so essentially ISIS goes into these towns, they capture these towns, and then they take the oil, they take these like resources that can get them a lot of money, then they sell these resources, they get this money, then they buy more weapons. This is extremely detrimental. Subpoint 4, ISIS is described by the New York Times as the richest terrorist organization the world has ever seen. What we see is that ISIS has a lot of money, and because of the fact that they have this much money, they're able to get more and more weapons, they're able to get more and more resources, and then capture more and more land by using these resources and using these weapons. The link to this is that the plan passes. Subpoint 8 to this is ISIS is combated by the United States. ISIS is combated by the United States, and even if the United States cannot continuously push ISIS back, as long as they keep ISIS in place, ISIS can no longer continuously get these resources that they're getting. And if ISIS can't get these resources, then they can't continue to buy these weapons. And if they can't buy these weapons, then obviously they can't fight. So subpoint B, ISIS cannot expand. No more resources from them to expand. If they can't capture these resources, which is how they actually get their weapons and their funding to actually cause this terror, they can't do this, and they can't fight, obviously. So the impacts of this is to be less resources for ISIS, less funding for ISIS, and as a whole, less weapons for ISIS, which means ISIS can cause less violence in the Middle East. With that, the third advantage we have for you today, you can tagline is regional stability. Subpoint 1 is lots of people want to join ISIS. ISIS is extremely good with social media. They try and tug people's heartstrings and stuff like that. They tell them to come to Iraq and Syria and help them fight against these other people, and they have actually done an extremely good job in doing this. A lot of people from the United States have gone to Iraq and Syria to help ISIS fight, and from all over the world. So this is extremely bad because ISIS is able to use this. Subpoint 3, if ISIS is able to capture all this land and all this land is being taken by ISIS, then essentially they get a giant public relations boost. They can be like, oh look, we're winning, and that's extremely detrimental because if ISIS is winning, then more and more people are going to continuously join them and try and join the bandwagon. Subpoint 4, more people are forced to join ISIS if they capture more land. ISIS captures lands, they take these people captive and then they force them to fight for them. So if we're stopping ISIS from capturing this land, so less people are actually joining ISIS. The link to this is that the plan passes. Internal link A is essentially a perceptual link. If the United States is killing all these ISIS troops, then nobody's going to want to join ISIS. They're not going to be like, oh, we're going to join this terrorist organization so that we can get killed. If a lot of ISIS troops are being killed, then nobody's going to want to join ISIS because they're scared to be actually killed. So the impact of this is to be less ISIS soldiers. Less people want to join ISIS because they're scared that they're going to get killed by the United States' biggest and baddest military in the world today. So we see less people actually joining ISIS as a whole, and we see less death as a whole because ISIS has less resources to cause this death with. So for all these reasons, I just strong vote in favor of the affirmation team. Thank you.
You guys want to do
Off 3 off, by the way, we'll go off.
three? Roadmaps, good.
The answer is yes, there is a CD. Okay. QBI. Everyone ready?
Mm-hmm.
So just to tell you what I'm going to do, first I'm going to go over the negations counter plan, and then I'm going to go over our disadvantages to the plan, some issues of solvency, which plan would be more effective, and then we'll go over the affirmative advantages. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So in this round, the negative team will be defending a counter plan. Now, the essence of what we're doing here is we're saying that we should not, in fact, send ground troops in and to intervene because there's a more effective way of intervening that would avoid some of the detriments of sending in ground troops while gaining many of the same benefits, if not more effectively, than their plan. Let me get into the text of our counterplan. The text of our counterplan is as follows. Oh, here it is. The text of our counterplan is that we would send weapons to the moderate rebels. Currently, we're funding this at $500 million. Instead, we would increase that funding to $5 billion. So the U.S. would increase its funding for weapons for moderate rebels within Syria to $5 billion. The State Department would determine which rebels count as moderate. We have a system for determining this based on their past track record, and there would also be a requirement that the groups we fund are currently engaged in direct fighting against ISIS. This is as soon as possible in normal means. Any questions on the counterplan?
We're good.
Now, the reason this counterplan competes, the reason that voting for this counterplan means rejecting the affirmative plan is because the counterplan shows you that there is a more effective way to do the same thing while avoiding some of the detriments, which means that there's no reason to adopt the plan when it's less effective and more dangerous than the counterplan. This is called competing through net benefits. They're going to come up and say that you can do both the plan and the counterplan, that you can both send in troops and also fund the rebels. But what we're showing you is that you would gain no additional benefits while incurring extra costs by doing so. That's let me launch into our 2 disadvantages. Yes, 2. Our first disadvantage is ISIS backlash. Inherency is that currently ISIS is being beaten back. Last week, the New York Times reported that ISIS is in fact losing territory in absolute numbers in both Iraq and Syria. This is partially a result of U.S. ground troops, partially a result of U.S. airstrikes, and partially a result of the efforts of rebels within Syria as well as the Iraqi government. The link is that the U.S. intervenes with its ground troops, 15,000 troops, against ISIS. This has 2 effects. First of all, ISIS would be able to use this for propaganda purposes. Every time that there's an attack against ISIS or another group like this, sending boots onto the ground is a very important perceptual step to take because it crosses a line from merely supporting other forces to actively killing ISIS troops on the ground on your own. ISIS would exploit that to the fullest. They've shown in their own case that ISIS is great at using social media. ISIS would use that great social media to recruit people and use the U.S. invasion as a way to rally them. The second thing that would happen is that Sunni populations of Iraq would get scared. The U.S. has a terrible reputation. The U.S. has a terrible reputation with Sunni populations within Iraq because it had support for the Shiite government previously, the Shiite government of Nur al-Maliki, as they said, which did oppress the Sunnis. This means that if the United States gets anywhere near Iraq, those Sunnis are going to be scared. Those Sunnis will be worried that they will not be protected by the government, and what they'll do, because they will be scared, is they will turn to ISIS. Because ISIS is the only Sunni group that proposes that they can protect them right now. In the United States, they would be afraid that the United States would not protect them, considering its past track record of supporting people like Nur al-Maliki who oppressed the Sunnis. This means that ultimately we would strengthen ISIS's recruiting, we would strengthen ISIS, and we would make it easier for ISIS to actually regain the territory that it's losing. The plan would actually have a net detriment. The plan would make it easier for ISIS to retake territory. Our second disadvantage is strengthening the Syrian government. Currently, you have to understand something about the way the war is going in Syria. In Syria, there's a civil war. On one side, you have the government. On another side, you have the rebels. On a third side, you have ISIS. ISIS is fighting both the government and the rebels. And the issue is, if we defeat ISIS, but don't replace them with the rebels or don't strengthen the rebels at all, the Syrian government is well equipped to fill in that vacuum and to take control. So the link is that if we attack ISIS and ISIS gets beaten back, the Syrian government will use its superior forces, its superior numbers, its superior training to fill in that vacuum. That means the Syrian government will no longer have to spend nearly as many troops going after ISIS because we did it for them. Now they can go after the Syrian opposition, which means the moderate rebels would be crushed by the Syrian government. Now, the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has promised brutal retaliation against the moderate groups if he ever does retake control of these areas, which means you could see thousands or tens of thousands of deaths in retribution against the Sunni rebels who were fighting the Syrian government. So this means that Syria would not only have thousands of deaths from the Assad government crushing the opposition, but it would also be plunged back into dictatorship. Now let's move on to some points about solvency. What we're going to demonstrate to you is that funding the rebels with arms is a much more effective strategy to defeat ISIS than the affirmative plan of sending in ground troops. Let's look at a few reasons why the affirmative plan won't solve. First of all, there will be an ISIS backlash. That's our first disadvantage. ISIS will respond, the Sunnis will get scared, the Sunnis will ally with ISIS, which means we will turn the population against us. That would make it impossible to win an insurgency war against ISIS. Second of all, ISIS has no local knowledge. ISIS has no, the United States has no local knowledge. It doesn't have any knowledge of the areas, of the groups. It doesn't have the same credibility that rebels do. Finally, we would turn the population against ISIS and help their recruitment. Now, on the other hand, let's look why the solvency is better on our side. Why we would actually do more to fight ISIS by providing funding to the rebels than we would by sending in ground troops. First of all, these rebels do have the local knowledge. These rebels know the population. These rebels know how best to fight in these areas. These rebels would not be, as the United States was when it invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, unable to defeat an insurgency because it doesn't know the area well. Furthermore, we can see clearly that $500 million, which we've given so far to the rebels, has already served to push back ISIS in certain areas of Syria, which shows that $5 billion, which is 10 times as much, would be more than enough to have a significant effect. Finally, they have experience fighting ISIS, which we don't. They know their tactics. They can defeat them. Let's move on to the affirmative case. Now, the affirmative case is all based on the idea that their plan is better than our plan, that their plan is effective at defeating ISIS, and that our plan would not be more effective. First of all, On their point about saving lives, let's just note that ISIS would react with more violence and more killing if the U.S. intervenes in an attempt to make it leave and to make it not intervene, whereas no similar thing would happen if the U.S. were to simply fund the rebels. They also say that Nouri al-Maliki is causing tensions. I would note that Nouri al-Maliki has been replaced from office. That destroys the uniqueness on their first contention, because that means that the way things currently are is not as they say it is. Finally, they say that ISIS kills a lot of people, but our point about how Assad would crush the opposition results in more deaths. Assad crushing the opposition would kill more people than ISIS is currently killing, which means that clearly the bigger impact is on our side. Finally, on their second advantage about limiting ISIS's resources and their third advantage about regional stability, again, I would simply point out that to win these advantages, they need to prove to you that sending ground troops in is effective. On the negative side, we've shown you that sending ground troops in is not effective, that it would in fact strengthen ISIS, and that even if you believe it's effective, sending in aid to the rebels, the moderate rebels within Syria, would be a much more effective strategy to achieve the same thing. For all these reasons, we strongly urge a negative vote.
I guess I'll move into the middle so you can see me on the camera, Artem. Maybe the second time I've moved from my seat at this entire tournament.
Get some order.
Yeah, I'm about to figure that out. Okay, so I think what I'm gonna do is go over counterplan, DAs, and then half case in that order, starting on the plan when I get to the affirmative case. Alright. Looking good? Alright, is everyone ready? Starting time now. Hello everyone, thank you for coming out here to make this most educational debate possible. Congrats to everybody for making it this far. I know SEMS at a tournament this big is a really big deal, and I'm proud of all of us here in this room for still being here, still being awake and alive after all of the delays that we've been through. Without further ado though, I'm just going to jump right onto the counter plan. Hey, okay, so they come up and they're talking about how we can do both of these things at the same time. The answer to that is yes, we can do both of these things at the same time. So if we can prove, and basically what the I'm on predicted time, and also I'll take your point if I have time at the end.
Sure.
So basically the CP is supposed to be a test of opportunity cost. It's basically a disadvantage that says, oh, the affirmative's case makes this thing impossible, and this thing is better to do than the affirmative case because of the following reasons. And even if, and so they say that they're competitive through net benefits. If we can prove to you that they are not competitive through net benefits, and that it is in fact better to do both the plan and the counterplan at the same time, then we win today's debate. And if we can prove to you that it's better to do the plan alone instead of the counterplan, we also win today's debate. And if they can prove to you that counterplan or the status quo is better, then they win the debate. So let's just move on to the counterplan really quickly. So basically we have the permutation. We can do both of these things at the same time. It's not actually a test of opportunity cost to the plan. If we can do both of these things at the same time, we win the debate. And then also, the first thing I have two solvency responses to this. The first thing we have solvency is basically the United States has more solvency because we're only fighting against ISIS. We can concentrate on beating out ISIS rather than beating out both ISIS and the rebels. Basically, we're not being attacked on two fronts as we go in as the United States, which means that we're better able to concentrate and solve the ISIS issue. And then if you look at it, also you see that rebels are logistically less coordinated and have less intelligence information than the United States. So if you see it, they're going to have less intelligence. And according to Sun Tzu, the author of The Art of War, basically, you see that foreknowledge is the most important thing that a good commander can have. And so that basically, if you have more intelligence, you are better able to solve military issues. And so that's why you want to be preferring the United States, is because we have the intelligence and logistical ability to actually deal with these groups. Now, moving on to their disadvantages, basically the first thing they come up and talk about is the civil war in Syria. If you look at this, basically the perm solves this, because if we fund both the rebels and do the plan at the same time, then the rebels get all of this extra money, and we can also fight against ISIS more effectively. So if you look at it, if you buy the permutation, then you also can throw this disadvantage out, because it doesn't actually apply to our plan, because the counter plan solves. And if you look at it, basically they say if ISIS, like basically if we just send in troops, like we can't also fight back against the Assad regime. If we send in troops and do the funding, what happens is that we're fighting back against ISIS more effectively, but we are also solving back for the Assad regime. And that's where the permutation wins us this disadvantage, disadvantage. And even if you believe that, like, of course the United States already has a vested interest in fighting against Assad, and we're already aiding the rebels. The rebels are still fighting against Assad, and they're fighting against ISIS. The thing is if we take out ISIS, then the rebels will be able to focus more on the Assad regime, which means that they won't actually have to be being attacked on two fronts by both ISIS and the Assad regime, which means that our plan still solves for this DA. And then if you look at it, they also talk about basically ISIS basically using the United States like aggression as a card for basically recruiting more people, and they say that Sunni Muslims are going to get scared. So the first thing that I have to this is basically they say that like ISIS is still being driven back. Like, okay, we have, if you look to our, I believe it was our first advantage, we talk about how it's I believe it was the General, I believe it was Chuck Hagel, has specifically stated that establishing the border between Iraq and Syria once again is key to stopping ISIS, and that this is too complicated for either Iraqi or Syrian forces to do. I'll get to your point at the end of this DA. And then basically we basically come out with this. Even if my partner didn't explicitly state this, like this is what it is. Basically, we have this warrant from the defense. So we have this basically saying that establishing a border between Iraq and Syria is key to actually establishing peace in the region. Again, you look at this, and so you see that like ISIS isn't actually being driven back. Like they have literally a territory the size of Belgium. Like obviously not enough is happening in the status quo. They say that ISIS is being driven back, but they don't show you where they're being driven back. You see in the town of Mosul, like ISIS is still very prevalent there. All of these issues are still occurring in the status quo. And if we look down to the link level, or how they say that our plan causes issues, basically what you say is, and what they come up and they say is like propaganda, basically that ISIS is going to just like use the United States aggression in order to recruit more people. Like this is completely false. Like if you look at it, the fact of the matter is that nobody wants to join an organization that's being thoroughly routed. If joining ISIS meant that you were going to die, then you would not join ISIS. It's just simple logic. Like if we look at this is not how this is going to work. I'll get to, and then also, yeah, okay, the first of two.
Okay, so people wouldn't join ISIS because joining ISIS would be irrational if you know you're going to die, but isn't joining ISIS irrational anyways?
Okay, so the way that they look at this is ISIS is actually winning right now. Like, ISIS has captured literally the size of Belgium, so ISIS looks like the big bad, wolf on the block or whatever, where basically what they're doing is taking over the region. So ISIS is actually winning, and so people join ISIS because they feel unsafe. Like, they feel like if ISIS can capture 30,000 square miles of territory, they can probably capture their hometown too, so it's better to just join ISIS than die. And that's the rationale that's going on behind this, and so that's why, everyone, they wouldn't join ISIS. Because, they think joining ISIS is irrational, obviously, because ISIS doesn't pose a threat to their lives, but, it poses a threat to the lives of people living in the Middle East. Let's go on to the plan. So basically they say that, the counter plan solves better. Again, we come up and we say the permutation solves better. They never tell you why the United States specifically is bad, other than this, propaganda point, which we've already completely refuted. And also, they say United States doesn't have local knowledge. Okay, Syrian rebels don't have satellites. So this is basically just a wash here. You're gonna want to be doing both of those things, obviously, because it's better. Both sides, or both of these actors are going to have more logistical support if you actually combine them. And if you look at it, the fact of the matter is we go on to our lives things. You say, okay, the sectarian prime minister has been replaced. Okay, even if the sectarian prime minister has been replaced, Iraq still isn't stopping ISIS. So you can extend this uniqueness. ISIS is still very prevalent in Iraq and Syria. That's why we're having this debate around right now. And then they come up and they talk about how ISIS is basically just going to retaliate with more violence. ISIS is going to get beat. We talk about this. We say that this is basically key to checking back for ISIS. We say that our plan is the only way that we can solve, because the United States troops currently aren't there. It's not working. We have warrants from 2 major generals in the United States Army that say that we need this to happen now. And so at this point, you're going to be wanting to extend this all the way across the flow, because even if ISIS does respond with more violence, eventually they will be gone. We talk about regional stability. They come up and they say CP solves. In response to this, my partner and I basically say that, okay, the permutation solves better, because instead of just having, people with local knowledge, you get satellite knowledge and local knowledge. You're able to check back better for ISIS. And then if you look at it, we also talk about cutting off resources. Again, all they say to this is counterplan. We say permutation. Permutation is better because counterplan is not actually mutually exclusive, and it would be better to do both. Thank you.
You guys ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's pre-competition. I'm just going to go AF and neg. All right, let's start. Okay, so on the first advantage of the affirmation about saving lives, the response is that by having no satellite knowledge, that of course these ground troops that Syria has and these rebel forces are not going to be able to do anything. Of course, what they miss here and what they don't ever address is that they know the region better and they're better able to engage in this guerrilla warfare that's going on there. This means that they solve better because they can do this. Now, having troops that have satellite knowledge has no effect. Right now we see that we've been very ineffective at hitting them with drone strikes in several cases. Now the issue here is that if we can't even hit them with drone strikes, with advanced satellite technology, why are we going to be able to direct ground troops to hit them with this same satellite technology? Drones are much faster, and these ground troops take time to move. Basically what we see is we engage in guerrilla warfare that we're going to lose, and we have more on that in a little bit. So they then make this argument that Iraq isn't stopping them, even if they win this, and we've already mentioned that Iraq is, or that they're being pushed back, that the rebels are being slowed, but not stopped completely, and that's why we have to have movement there. They talk about how ISIS is going to beat the current situations, and that ISIS would beat the rebels. Again, there's no proof for this. They provide no reason to believe that ISIS would beat the rebels. The rebels, with this funding, would be much better armed and would be backed by the largest government in the world. They then provide this idea of the warrants from the US generals as a reason that we need this. First of all, these generals were not effective in previous situations with ISIS. There's no reason to believe that our current tactics with ISIS are ineffective, that these generals have a more effective strategy when we're already doing several of their strategies, so you can just drop that. Going on to their second advantage, they don't ever prove that their plan is more effective in eliminating these resources. What we see is that when they get into this war with ISIS, they're going to energize the Sunni population. As my partner talks about, the Sunni population is not like the United States, and because they don't like the United States, what we see is that they're going to join ISIS. Now, the opponent's only response to this is that the only reason they're currently joining ISIS is that there is no other option. But the issue here is that that's not the case for a lot of it. First of all, the Shiite population is not joining ISIS and is getting slaughtered. Second of all, the Sunni population is joining ISIS because they agree with their cause and because it's the only group that can actually provide them protection, because the US government doesn't provide them protection. In fact, the US government often goes out and hunts them and pursues them, and this causes the Sunnis to side with ISIS. If we go in, all that we do is we increase this tension between the US and between the Sunnis and lead to more Sunnis joining ISIS. Even if the US is not going to go after Sunnis, we still have this perceptual link where the Sunnis feel persecuted by the United States and feel that they are going to be in trouble if the United States takes over. So basically the Sunnis end up siding with ISIS instead. Going on to their third contention about regional stability and how they're solving better with the permutation. I'll get on to the permutation later. Their second response to this is the satellites, and again, satellites are not a reason to vote for them. Just because we have satellites does not mean we're the biggest or best military in the world. We are better for other reasons, but in guerrilla warfare, we've been proven ineffective multiple times. In fighting ISIS, we've been proven ineffective multiple times. We're not effective in terrain we don't know. We're not effective in this hit and run tactic. They've never proven that we can fight ISIS in that manner, other than their quotes by their quotes by defense secretaries, and even these don't provide adequate proof because they are currently not working, so their own ideas shouldn't necessarily work in the future. So going on to the counterclaim, their argument is that a perm should do both, or that it's a test of competition to do both. But what we see is its net benefits competitive. Overall, the benefits of doing the counterplan outweigh the benefits of doing just the plan. So if we look at overall, we have two disadvantages on the plan. Even if you buy that our second disadvantage gets dropped by the perm, then we still have one disadvantage on the plan. Since we claim every single one of their advantages, even if they do both, they only solve for their three advantages and one disadvantage. If we think about this as simple math, this adds up to 2. Now, when we look at it as just the counterplan, we have 3 advantages. We link into all of those, and they never sever us from these impacts. Because they never sever us from their impacts, don't let them do it in their next speech. That would not be fair to us. That would not give us time to address it in later speeches. So we link into all 3 of their advantages, and don't link into our own disadvantage. Because we do that, we should win today's debate because we are a better policy option. We prove that the US federal government should not send in ground troops, and that's the burden of the negation. So going on to a little bit of solvency, to go on to this issue of solvency about how ISIS, or how if we just send in US ground troops, we don't have to focus on ISIS on 2 fronts. First of all, we already said we were going to choose moderate rebel groups that were going to be fighting ISIS. So they're fighting ISIS. they're going to be more effective at fighting ISIS because they know the terrain, because they're better at these guerrilla tactics, and that solves better back for that. They also never address in our solvency the backlash by the Sunnis. This is very important that they never address this in the entirety of their speech. That the Sunnis are going to have a backlash, that they're going to join the ISIS forces, and that leads to an increase in ISIS, which makes it harder for them to solve, and ultimately makes them lose this debate, because by having these Sunnis join ISIS, they just lead to more violence, greater number of killings, and a larger ISIS that we later have to combat in a different means. Going on to their second argument on solvency, they argue again that we have less intelligence because we don't have satellites. Again, as I've proven over and over again, we don't need these satellites in order to be effective. So going on to our first disadvantage, which is that about ISIS backlash. Their only response is that ISIS is going to be driven back by any of their plans, but they have not addressed the Sunni backlash, and that's the most important issue in this debate, because this Sunni backlash is what turns the tide of their case, because they're only sending in 15,000 troops, and what we see is that if the Sunni backlash is larger than that 15,000 troops, we could easily wash out their troops, and no matter what, all we've done now is killed 15,000 troops and done nothing to stop ISIS. We at least provide regional groups that can fight ISIS, that have already been fighting ISIS, and that have better tactics in being able to do this. The second point that they really drop is about propaganda. They admit that ISIS is great at social media, and that ISIS is great at getting people to join them. And then they completely drop the fact that the United States going in only provides more incentive to ISIS to use this propaganda, and more incentive to everyone else to believe that the US is going in for its own causes. Their only response to this is that that this isn't going to happen because joining ISIS is irrational. Again, extend what my partner said, joining ISIS, whether or not the US is there, is irrational, so no matter what, it's irrational. They're going to join because it's an extremist force and they have no other option. For all these reasons, vote negative in today's debate.
Okay, is everyone ready? So this is the speech where I outline the round and explain to you why you should be voting for the negative side. Thanks to our great debate, everyone. I'd like to start with an explanation of the concept of conditionality. Now, the way it works is that the negative team, to win a round in debate, needs to argue one of two things. Either we need to prove to you that no action whatsoever should be taken, or we need to prove to you that the action that should be taken is something other than the plan. Now, at first, we outlined for you a counterplan and said, here's an option you can have that would solve better for the affirmative plan. But we're going to make this round simpler, and we're going to just set aside the counterplan. And we're going to return to the basic comparison that we started the round with, which is a comparison of no action to plan action. Now, they're going to say something about how, well, you can't do this, and this is conditional, and you're changing your advocacy and everything, but there's three reasons they can't do this. First of all, they never asked the status of our counterplan. Our counterplan has always been conditional. It's the job of the affirmative team to ask us whether our plan is conditional if they're curious about that. Second of all, we've spent basically an entire second speech burning time on this issue. So if they say that we're wasting their time or we're skewing time or something, you should drop all those answers, because clearly we're wasting a lot of time on our side too. But most importantly, what does that say? Yeah, the most important reason is that we have no chance to answer this. And also because they've conceded this. They said at one point, if you listen to your flow or look very carefully at your flow, they said at one point that we need to defend either a counterplan, a competitive counterplan, or the status quo, which means that the affirmative team concedes the fact that we're allowed to argue for the status quo. And of course, the status quo is what the neg usually argues. So on that note, disregard the counterplan, focus on the comparison between a world where we do intervene with 15,000 ground troops and a world where we don't. We have two voter issues. Our first voter issue is that you would strengthen the Syrian government. Now, the affirmative team has conceded this point. Their only response was that the PERM solves, that doing both the plan and the counterplan would solve this, but we've kicked the counterplan. Now we just want to compare the way the world would be before the plan to the way the world is after the plan. You can see that before the plan, ISIS acts as a check against the Syrian government. ISIS may kill a lot of people, but it doesn't kill nearly as many as the Syrian government, and it doesn't kill anywhere near the order of magnitude of people that Syria would kill if it were to conquer the rebels and take over the territory that is currently held by the rebels. They've conceded all of that. Don't let them walk back on that. Don't let them reverse their positions on this, because they've conceded all of the essence of this contention in their second speech, and it would be unfair to us that since we don't have another speech to respond, that they would suddenly change what they're saying in their last speech. So they've conceded on this point that the Syrian government would become strengthened. that a strengthened Syrian government would inevitably overwhelm the rebels, and that overwhelming the rebels would lead to massive death on a large scale because the Syrian government hates the rebels, because the Syrian government has vowed to avenge the rebels. They made this new answer about the idea that the rebels are, that if we defeat ISIS, who is also fighting the rebels, that would free up the rebels to fight the Syrian government. But the issue here is that there's not a lot of direct fighting between the rebels and ISIS. In particular, the rebel groups that are fighting the Syrian government are not the same as the rebel groups that are fighting ISIS. So if we fight ISIS,
Point
then
of order, this whole thing about like the rebel groups that are fighting ISIS are not the same as fighting the Syrian government is a new argumentation that was never brought up.
it's not functionally new because you have the same number of chances to respond as if he had brought it up in his second speech. What I'm saying is, if my partner brought it up in his second speech, he would have one response. If I bring it up now, you have one response.
We have less time to have responses.
You still have 5 minutes. Anyways,
Under consideration.
so even if you don't buy that point, they've conceded the essence of this point, which is that the Syrian government would be strengthened. Their only response was the PERM, but the PERM falls away because the counterplan is conditional. Now we just need to compare a world without the plan to a world with the plan. Second of all, and most importantly, we turn the solvency on their entire case because their entire case is based on the idea that sending in ground troops would be effective against the Syrian government. They've conceded that the Sunnis are incredibly scared of the United States because of its support for brutal leaders like Nur al-Maliki, who, in their first speech, they talked about how bad Nur al-Maliki was. They've conceded all of these important things, and this means that the Sunnis would rather be with ISIS than with the United States. And if they perceive a threat that the United States is going to come in and continue the oppression that it had for the past 10 years, then they will flock to ISIS, and that will strengthen ISIS, which ultimately means their plan does nothing to solve the problem. So here's the way the round breaks down for us. First of all, we've shown you their plan is ineffective because the Sunnis would flock to ISIS. They would only strengthen recruitment. That would make it harder to fight ISIS, not easier. Sending in ground troops is not the answer. We would end up with another Iraq, another Afghanistan. However, even if you believe that we would be effective in stopping ISIS, ISIS is small potatoes compared to the monster we would be unleashing, and that monster is the Syrian government. If we let ISIS be defeated and don't replace them with a rebel counterweight, which is what the plan does, if we defeat the main thing that's currently holding back the Syrian government will be able to free itself from fighting a war on two fronts, focus its entire energies on defeating the rebels that it has wanted to crush for 4 years but is unable to do so. When Syria crushes the rebels, that will be more death, more destruction, and more harm to the Syrian people than any benefit we could possibly gain by taking out ISIS. So for all these reasons, we strongly urge a negative vote.
Okay, everybody ready? Yeah. Okay, everybody ready? Okay. Starting my time now. I have 4 main reasons why we believe that the affirmation team has clearly won today's debate. The first and foremost being try or die for the affirmation team. Essentially, the negation team, when they're refuting our case, they didn't really refute our case. All they said is the counter plan solves better for the affirmations case than the affirmations case does. And then what they do in their last speech is they kick out of their counter plan. That's completely fine and dandy, but the fact is now that they're kicked out of the counter plan, they haven't refuted our case. Because earlier, the refutations that they made to our case were essentially, oh yeah, these things don't matter because the counter plan solves better. Well, now there's no counter plan, and now we're advocating for the status quo. So the affirmation team is the only team in today's round that's actually trying to make a change in today's debate. If you look at it, all our things about how we're going to stop ISIS, how we're going to kill ISIS troops and stop ISIS's spread of violence. So the second thing about how we're going to stop ISIS getting these resources, the third, the perceptual link, all those things have now gone completely unrefuted. Because the negation team, when they first refuted, they said, oh, the counter plan is going to refute this. And then they kick out of their counter plan. So now they have no refutations to our case. So our case completely stands strong and proud, and that is why you should be voting for us right then and there, because essentially they have no refutations to our case. Our case has gone unrefuted, and that is the biggest thing in today's round, because they are advocating for the status quo. And in the status quo, we see ISIS is continuously going through town by town, killing as many people as they possibly can. You see in June, they killed like 2,000 people only in June. And now, the negation team has no way to solve for ISIS. The affirmation team is the only team in today's round that is even attempting to solve for ISIS. The negation team is saying, no, let ISIS do whatever they want, we're not going to do anything about it. The affirmation team is the only team that's actually trying to stop ISIS and trying to stop the terror that they're spreading in the Middle East. And that is why you should be voting for us. Because essentially now they have no refutations to our case, and also, yeah. So yeah, so right then and there you should be signing your ballot for the affirmation team because we're actually solving for ISIS and they have not refuted the fact that we're solving for ISIS. And the negation team is not trying to do anything to actually solve for this omnicidal terrorist organization. We both agree that ISIS is a bad thing, but the affirmation team is the only team that's actually trying to take steps to solve for ISIS. Also, yeah. So secondly, we have. Secondly, let's go into the DA about backlash. They essentially talk about backlash. They said like, oh, ISIS backlash. ISIS is going to backlash if the United States attacks. But the fact is that there can be no ISIS backlash if the United States takes care of ISIS. If the United States is able to go into the Middle East and overpower ISIS, and we like take apart these ISIS troops, not allow ISIS to have any power in the Middle East, then how can ISIS possibly have any possible way to actually backlash against the United States? If the United States dismantles ISIS, then ISIS can't backlash against the United States because they have no troops, they have no resources, they have no ability to backlash against the United States if the United States is taking care of ISIS in the first place. So you look at it, that was like their only disadvantage. They talk about ISIS backlash. They said like, oh, ISIS is going to counteract. Well, they can't counteract if we've taken away all their troops, if we've taken away all their resources, Judge. And secondly, they talk about if you take away the resources, they have no more money for supplies and stuff like that, for weapons. And secondly, they talk about like Sunni troops, they talk about like Sunni people are going to join ISIS. Well, if there's no ISIS left for the Sunni troops to join them, they're not actually going to join ISIS. Because if the United States takes care of ISIS, as we were saying, the affirmation team, we're advocating that the United States will dismantle ISIS. And the negation team has not refuted anything in that manner. So if the United States takes apart ISIS, then the negation team, then essentially these Sunni people can no longer join ISIS because there's no ISIS for them to actually join. So they're not even solving for that there. So yeah, you should be voting for us right then and there. And then lastly, let's go into a second disadvantage, which is really the only offense left in the round. But judges, I just like to really stress the fact that you should already be voting for the affirmation team. Even if you buy the disadvantages, you should still be voting for the affirmation team because ISIS is by far the biggest thing in today's round. The fact is ISIS is an homicidal terrorist organization that is killing tens of thousands of people, and that is by far the biggest impact in today's round. So if only you buy our case and you don't buy any of our refutations to their case, you should still be voting for the affirmation team because we are solving for ISIS, and the negation team is not trying to do anything to solve for ISIS whatsoever. And then let's go into the whole civil war thing. Essentially, they talk about how these rebels are going to be able to fight against Bashar al-Assad, and Bashar al-Assad will take over. First of all, Bashar al-Assad is already in power in Syria right now. Like, they're not doing anything. It's already
Point of order.
Stopping time.
Yep.
This was our second disadvantage. It was brought up in our first constructive speech.
Okay, but
so all your answers are
But
new.
the refutations that your partner brought up, my partner's refutations to your disadvantage came up in your second speech.
Okay, but these are new answers to my second disadvantage, which came up in the first speech. Bringing up now makes it completely new.
My response.
Okay.
Which one was this? Civil War.
Okay, I'll just keep on. Okay, also secondly, like, talk about the fact that my partner brought this up, that we're already funding the rebels. Like, the United States is already funding the rebels in the status quo. Like, the rebels are being funded by the United States anyways, so, like, there's really no issue there because the rebels are already receiving troops from the United States to fight against Bashar al-Assad. There's really no need for anything else. And also talk about the fact that my partner brought up that if we get rid of ISIS, then these rebels now no longer have to focus on ISIS because these rebels in the status quo are fighting against ISIS. So if we destroy ISIS, if we dismantle ISIS, then these rebels can no longer have to fight against ISIS and Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian government power, but now they can just focus their eyes on Bashar al-Assad. And that is why you should be not voting on this because it's essentially a civil war. Like, if we take apart ISIS, then now these rebels, they don't have to fight against ISIS, they don't have to fight against Bashar al-Assad, but they only have to fight against Bashar al-Assad, so we're really solving for that right then and there. Yeah, so impact calculus, you clearly see we're winning because we are solving for ISIS. We're the only team in today's round that's solving for ISIS, and the negation team essentially has no impacts in today's round because we've taken away from their first disadvantage and we've taken away their second disadvantage. They have no impacts whatsoever in today's round. They're not solving for anything, and also look at the fact that our case has gone completely unrefuted by the negation team, and for all these reasons, I just strong vote in favor of the affirmation team. Thank you. Good debate, guys.
Good debate.
Good debate.
Should we go outside?
Yes, please.
Step on.